Until relatively recently, the most terrifying maniac in Russia and the USSR was considered the infamous Andrei Chikatilo with 53 proven murders to his name, or Nikolai Spizivtsev with presumably 82 murders. But in 2012, it seems they had a competitor. On January 10, 2018, the second trial of serial killer Mikhail Popkov took place in the Irkutsk Regional Court. Junior lieutenant of the militia, now a pensioner of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Popkov had already been sentenced to life imprisonment for 22 murders and 2 attempted murders. However, almost immediately after the verdict was handed down, Popkov began confessing to new crimes, and now the investigation attributes to him another 59 murders and 1 attempted murder. The guilt of the Angarsk maniac was proven in 80 murders, making Popkov officially the bloodiest serial killer in the history of Russia and the USSR. It's also important that the murderer may not have told about all his crimes yet. From 1992, when Popkov first attacked a woman, up to the last investigated crime to date, committed in 2010, the defendant methodically destroyed, figuratively speaking, an entire village, 80 people, says investigator for particularly important cases of the Investigative Committee of Russia, SKR, for the Irkutsk region, Lieutenant Colonel of Justice Yevgeny Karchevsky. At the same time, surprisingly, not all the women he put in his car to drive them home were killed. He even escorted many to the door of their entrance and waited until the light came on in the windows. He helped some carry heavy things to the door. Yet he raped and killed precisely those who got into his car. Voluntarily. Popkov never dragged anyone in by force. The Popkov case has already cast a black stain on the reputation of Irkutsk's law enforcement agencies at the end of the 20th century. For more than 8 years, detectives failed to notice that a serial killer was operating in Angarsk. Ordinary militiamen, even more so. One can view this in different ways. Alas, in modern Russian history, this is far from the only case. In 2008 in Moscow, for example, they were preparing a collegium of the capital's main directorate of the SKR dedicated to unsolved sexual crimes. Dozens of investigators and leaders, prosecutors and operatives reviewed reports on the cases, and only one female officer noticed that among the multitude of unsolved ones, there were 24 strikingly similar in the methods of the crimes. She requested the criminal files, and after a few hours of analysis, not only confirmed her suspicions but also sketched a presumptive portrait of the maniac. Just a few days later, he was detained. On the account of the traffic police officer were more than 36 rapes over 1.5 decades. And this series was overlooked in Moscow, where the best cadres of investigative bodies always converged. It's hard to say now whether someone deliberately ignored the serial crimes or, as they say, their eyes got glazed over. Muses, an experienced detective who participated in the work of the investigative group in the early 2000s. If you look closely at the initial operational investigative actions for all of Popkov's victims, there's really nothing to fault by and large. And there are differences in details. One died from stab wounds, the second from chopping wounds, the third from cutting wounds. Trace experts concluded that different knives were used, and that was indeed the case. Now we can say that the modus operandi could have been traced back then. The killer in all cases used sharp-edged murder weapons. He always aimed at the head. He always took the women away by car. But in the late 1990s, this knowledge didn't exist yet. And don't forget, from a criminological point of view, the Irkutsk region is not the most prosperous. There are not only many zones here, but also many former inmates. Regarding the Popkov case, there is another opinion. It was expressed in a conversation by State Counselor of Justice of the 3rd class, Major General Valery Kostarev, the very same former senior investigator for particularly important cases who identified the connection between several murders near Angarsk and first declared that a serial killer had appeared in the city, most likely connected to law enforcement agencies. The quality of operational search measures for the murders was appalling. Outrageously appalling, says General Kostarev. For many cases, formal work was done, and in those instances where a woman was simply listed as missing without a trace, sometimes there wasn't even that, 2 or 3 sheets with a request and a response to it were inserted into the folders. More than a third of the physical evidence was simply lost. Not even destroyed, but precisely lost. All the murder cases were with different investigators, and no one even tried to look for intersections in them. Perhaps the reason for such irresponsibility is simpler than it seems. Any serial crime is immediately put under control both in the Ministry of Internal Affairs and in the General Prosecutor's Office. They start demanding results separately and strictly, and neither the regional prosecutor nor the regional head of the main Directorate of Internal Affairs needed such a hassle. There were enough similar factors from the very beginning. Roughly the same place where the deceased were found, moreover in the Angarsk area. Roughly the same time of murders, similar traces at the crime scenes, and a similar modus operandi, recalls Valery Kostarev. Enough to at least consolidate the cases in the hands of one investigator. But local law enforcement officers were in no hurry to do that. However, one cannot accuse the detectives of complete inaction. Dozens of suspects were checked in connection with the murders in Angarsk. Even militiamen were under suspicion, and one crew of non-departmental security was checked for several months. It was believed that these employees were the last to see one of the missing women. At different times, charges were brought against 3 men uninvolved in these crimes. One was even tried, though in court, the murder charges were dropped. He was imprisoned for other crimes. One of the suspects was brutally beaten during interrogation, demanding confessions from him. But the series back then, in the 1990s, was not detected. In the end, Popkov was identified for almost 10 years. The beginning of the events that led to the detention of the Angarsk maniac was an article in one of the federal newspapers, published in 1999. It stated that in Angarsk, according to rumors, a maniac was operating, but law enforcement officers did not acknowledge it. The General Prosecutor's Office became interested in the article and requested for verification all unsolved criminal cases about the discovery of murdered women in the Irkutsk region. The person responsible for the verification was senior investigator at the General Prosecutor's Office Kostarev. We analyzed and compiled lists. Male owners of Niva cars, militia employees, physically strong ones, recounts Detective Samilov. When it turned out that the secretions were left by a man with the 3rd blood group, they began suspecting everyone with that group, and periodically cross-checked the lists. To make it clear, when enough material was accumulated and all those who matched all the signs were selected, there were 354 such people. It was these people who were invited to donate blood and epithelium for genetics. Among them was Popkov. By the way, when he came to give the sample, he seemed absolutely calm, and no one had suspicions at that moment. In reality, it only seemed that way. Right after giving the genetic sample, Popkov went to a lawyer and reported that he might become accused in a series of murders. And the next day, he left the city with his family. First to Central Russia, supposedly on vacation, and then to Vladivostok. There he was detained, moreover, with a weapon. According to Popkov himself, he went to buy a new car, but operatives believe he was simply trying to escape. According to a widespread opinion, Popkov confessed to the murders not all at once, but gradually because he did not want to go to the colony for life-sentence prisoners Black Dolphin, one of the harshest in the country. There are also defenders of the Angarsk maniac who claim that he did not commit most of the new crimes. However, this opinion is refuted by the investigation materials. For many murders, by the time of Popkov's detention, the physical evidence had not been preserved, and expertise is now impossible. But for each of the crimes, he gave such detailed testimony that leaves no doubt about his involvement. For example, the convict said that in early July 2000, in the forest near Irkutsk, he sent 2 women to the other world. At the same time, experts established that both were raped simultaneously, in one place and killed there as well. But one of the victims was killed almost a day later than the second. It was long impossible to understand how that happened. The contradiction was resolved by Popkov himself. During interrogation, he said that, upon arriving home after the murder, he discovered the loss of his MVD badge, on which his personal number was embossed, exactly the same as in his ID, and he was forced to return to the crime scene the next day, where he found the lost item. And after that, he discovered that one of the victims was showing signs of life, and he simply finished her off. Essentially, for each of the crimes, there are such testimonies that only the one who committed them could give. And in general, all the new episodes were established based on Popkov's own words, and only later proven through investigation. Moreover, 10 of Popkov's victims, before his own confessions, were generally considered missing without a trace, and he precisely indicated the burial sites, which no one but him could know. Every evening, Mikhail Popkov, parking his car in the garage, would inevitably shake out the mats, wash them and wipe them dry. Every morning, warming up the car, he would inevitably wipe it from the inside. Not everyone can boast such neatness. The Angarsk maniac loved cleanliness, but even more himself. Next in his ranking were cars. Only Japanese, especially Subaru. He did not recognize European ones. His family was in third place. At the same time, one cannot fail to note that Popkov's IQ is very high. He is smart and calculating. Having only a secondary technical education, and not in policing but in technology, he managed to rise to the officer rank of junior lieutenant. Popkov adores reading, is excellent at cars and jurisprudence, and also judging by everything at women. The killer always disarmed them with his brutal charm. Women loved Popkov and were drawn to him, especially in the destitute 1990s. Recounts one of his former lovers. He was athletic, fit, sober, with a good sense of humor, not ugly, an excellent lover. He always came to visit not empty-handed, either bringing good wine or some treat, against the background of all other men, just a prince on a white horse. And even his driving style evoked not only fear but also some respect, though he was quite aggressive behind the wheel. Nevertheless, nothing ever betrayed the killer in him. Externally, Popkov favorably stood out from his fellow townspeople. All positive, fit, neat, engaged in sports, even romantic, recalls Yevgeny Karchevsky. But that's all a facade, behind which hides the devil. In reality, he is inhuman, cruel, cold-blooded, and the feeling of pity is simply unknown to him. Everything human is alien to him. A distinctive feature of Popkov was his hard work. More precisely, his stramlania to earn money. While still serving in the militia, he took advantage of the relatively free schedule of a day on, 3 off, and did not disdain side jobs. He taxied, dug graves at the cemetery, agreed to any odd job. By Angarsk standards, Popkov was quite well off and not stingy. A comprehensive judicial, psychological, sexological, psychiatric expertise recognized Mikhail Popkov as fully sane, but it diagnosed him with homicidal mania. This is an urge to commit murders, specifically of humans. Formally, homicidal mania is considered merely a mental disorder, meaning the person suffering from it is deemed sane. But Popkov himself disagrees with the expert's conclusion and denies any disorders. In turn, all those involved in the investigation of the criminal case assert the Angarsk maniac considered himself a cleanser, ridding the world of fallen women. Right after the arrest, some media reported that Popkov was allegedly avenging these very fallen women for contracting syphilis. Meanwhile, it has been established that the Angarsk maniac suffered from no venereal diseases, and he was not impotent. His sexual function corresponds to his biological age, which is several years younger than his passport age. Interestingly, Popkov to this day remains a pensioner of the MVD, and he still transfers his entire pension to his only daughter. Although things were not entirely smooth in Popkov's service. In 1999, during duty, he beat a detainee. A scandal erupted, the junior lieutenant was suggested to resign. But the point is that service in the MVD in the Irkutsk region is equated to districts of the far north, meaning a year counts as 1.5. And Popkov's service in the ranks of the Soviet Army was also credited to his length of service, so his 14 years of total work experience formally became 20 years of service. Thus, the length of service allowed Junior Lieutenant Popkov to retire, which he did. And the criminal case initiated for the beating of the detainee was terminated due to reconciliation of the parties. He turned out clean. When in 1998 the first signs appeared that the murders of women in the Angarsk area were being linked into a series, Popkov tried through roundabout ways to get into the operational headquarters for investigating his own crimes. And then, after dismissal through his wife, an employee of the passport office of the OVD of Angarsk, Popkov received indirect data on the progress of the search. He analyzed incoming requests and quite accurately determined which ones related to the murders of women and which to other crimes. According to the investigation, the first crime of the Angarsk maniac was committed in 1992. He himself testified that he then caught his wife cheating. Returning home after a shift, he found 2 used condoms in the trash bin. Interestingly, Popkov did not even think of divorcing. In his opinion, the daughter should grow up in a complete family, and it was this that stopped him from going to court. But it overflowed the cup of hatred toward women, except for his only daughter. And Popkov decided to kill, as stated in the indictment, motivated by hatred toward women due to their dissolute behavior. All crimes were committed according to the same scheme. Popkov, while taxiing, drove through the city streets and himself offered women a ride to the needed place. If the representative of the fair sex easily supported the conversation, then followed a proposal to drink together and then to spend time together. If she or they, 5 times Popkov committed double attacks, agreed, she was doomed. Popkov and his passenger would stop at a store, where the murderer bought alcohol and then drove to nature. There they drank together, had sexual intercourse, which ended fatally. As murder weapons, a small infantry shovel, nails figured, but most often knives. Popkov took them from service. These were knives seized from administratively detained without drawing up the corresponding protocols. So the serial maniac had no shortage of cutting objects, especially since, in Popkov's own words as a militia employee, he perfectly understood. For his own safety, he needed to change the murder weapons, and then no one would suspect the same handwriting of the crimes. Absolutely everyone is convinced that Popkov raped the women, but proving it is often difficult. The criminal himself says that he almost always entered into intimate relations by mutual consent. One can believe this or not, but it cannot be disputed. For example, I cannot imagine that in the late 90s, 2 women would be willing to voluntarily give themselves to one man, moreover in front of a friend. But the legislation interprets any doubt in favor of the accused. So formally, Popkov has an order of magnitude fewer rapes than murder charges, especially since, for some crimes, the statute of limitations has expired. Only once was the victim of the Angarsk maniac a sober girl heading to the station to meet her mother who had come to visit. He drove her to the factory territory, raped and killed her, which he confessed to, and once he killed an unknown woman not at night, but in broad daylight, on the dam of the Irkutsk hydroelectric station. All 80 identified crimes of Popkov are united by a geographical sign. They were committed in the territory of the Irkutsk region. And the fact that the murders stopped in 2010, the accused himself tries to explain by the fact that he quit, realizing that the noose around him was tightening. But few believe him. After dismissal from the militia, Popkov was engaged in driving cars from Vladivostok to Irkutsk, and the route passes through 3 subjects of the Federation. I cannot rule out that there are more murders on his account, says Valery Kosterev. I myself looked at materials on missing persons in Buryatia, the Transbaikal territory in Primorai. That is, where the route used by car drivers passes. And there are similar materials there, but it needs to be sorted out. Proving it will be very difficult, but possible, if only one wants to. A similar point of view is held by absolutely all those involved in the investigation. And Popkov himself does not refute this version. At least, in response to the farewell from the operatives who worked on his case, he said, "Maybe we'll see each other again."